I have a fellow clergy friend who, for the past several months, his church has held its Sunday worship services outside. Parishioners sit in a wide circle of folding chairs around their church labyrinth. Facing the altar, they've moved onto the church steps. The parish children sit among them, their hands deep in the activity bins their youth minister has assembled for each child, filled with toys, stickers, books, and art supplies. Sometimes, the youngest children get restless, and one or more of them gets up and starts walking the labyrinth in the middle of the service. While the grown-ups chant a psalm, sing a hymn, or listen to a sermon, the youngest parishioners embody the way of faith with their little feet. Sometimes, if the worship music is particularly lively, they dance, or shout emphatic amens at the close of the Lord's Prayer, or wander over to the altar to get closer looks at the bread and the wine. I suppose some folks might find this distracting, but I love it. I love the unself-consciousness of children in worship. I love their curiosity, their intensity, their sure sense of welcome and belonging. I love that they're honest and wholly themselves in the presence of God. When they're delighted, we can see their joy, clear and plain. When they're bored, hungry, sad, scared, or irritable, they let us know that too. In this week's gospel reading, Jesus takes a little child into his arms, turns to his disciples, and says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." On the face of it, this tender gesture is so small and so simple, we easily miss its radicalism. But consider this. Jesus doesn't say, "Welcome the child because it's a kind or loving or generous thing to do." He says, "Do you want to see what God looks like? Do you want to find God's stand-in hidden here among you? Are you curious about the truest nature of divine greatness? Then welcome the child. Welcome the child, and you welcome God." The context for this remarkable claim is an argument that breaks out among the disciples when Jesus explains for the second time that he will suffer, die, and rise again after 3 days. The disciples don't understand a word Jesus says, but they're too afraid to ask questions. Instead, they argue about who among them is the greatest. When Jesus asks what their quarrel is about, they refuse to answer. They're too embarrassed. But he already knows why they're bickering. So he brings a child into their midst, gathers the child into his arms, and upends his disciples' notions of greatness and power. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Perhaps if I didn't have so much experience with children, both as a parent and as a previous children's minister, I'd be tempted to sentimentalize Jesus' gesture. I've heard well-meaning people suggest, for example, that Jesus likens children to God because children are so innocent, so good. Perhaps. But the children I know are also feisty, clever, quick, fierce, generous, selfish, naughty, obedient, curious, bored, quiet, loud, challenging, funny, surprising, creative, destructive, solemn, and exhausting. I think Jesus knew as much when he described children as trustworthy representations of God. So what can we really learn about God by welcoming children? How can children open us up to deeper, more authentic communion with the divine? What might children teach us about greatness? Here's the possibilities. Children show us that our imaginations are pathways to God. I spent several years teaching Sunday school, and there was rarely an occasion when I wasn't amazed by the imaginative scope of the kids in my classroom. They could stack 20 Lego bricks together and see an entire civilization. They could cover a piece of construction paper in what looked like scribbles and tell a fully formed story based on those wiggly lines. When I told them Bible stories, they could fill in creative details using the full range of their senses. Here's what the perfume in the women's alabaster jar smelled like. Here's what Peter's calloused feet and Jesus' hands felt like. Here's what the bread at the Last Supper tasted like. In our gospel reading, Jesus invites the disciples to imagine a world where death doesn't have a final word, where inexpressible suffering gives way to irrepressible joy, where resurrection is not merely a possibility, but a promise. But the disciples can't make the leap. They're bound by preconceived notions of who and what the Messiah must be, and they lack the imagination to envision a world as revolutionary as the one Jesus holds out to them. Doctrine, dogma, and theology, in other words, hold their spiritual senses captive. Welcome the child, Jesus says in response. Open your imaginations. Return to the capacity for wonder, newness, and strangeness you knew as a child. Children teach us to risk hard questions on our way to God. As I mentioned earlier, kids aren't afraid to ask awkward, challenging, and even impossible questions. They're naturally curious. They're not embarrassed by their ignorance, and they're willing to risk social discomfort to get the truth. If they don't understand something, they ask, and they persist in asking. In contrast, the disciples in this week's gospel story miss an opportunity to draw closer to Jesus because they're too afraid to ask hard questions. In telling them candidly about the suffering that lies in his future, Jesus offers his disciples the possibility of a deeper, more vulnerable making intimacy with him. But they refuse the invitation, either because they don't have the courage to admit their ignorance, or because they can't bear to hear truths that might cause them pain. Perhaps they believe, as we so often do, that avoiding the uncomfortable stuff will save them. Whatever the case, their unwillingness to ask tough questions of themselves, of each other, and of Jesus limits their growth and their fellowship with God. Children teach us to trust God's abundance. Young children generally expect that there is enough to go around, enough time, enough hugs, enough attention, enough love. It doesn't occur to them to fear scarcity unless they're conditioned to do so. Left to themselves, they assume plenitude. In her memoir, The Cloister Walk, Kathleen Norris tells a beautiful story about St. Therese of Lisieux. When Therese was 4 years old, she was shown a handful of colorful ribbons and asked to choose one. Entranced, she simply responded, "I choose all." The disciples in this week's story, though, don't believe that all isn't available in the kingdom of God. They don't lean into Jesus' generosity, sufficiency, and abundance. Believing that what's available to them is meager and inadequate to start with, they quarrel for first place, first dibs, first prize. In response, Jesus points them to the non-striving, unambitious, open-hearted trust of a young child. As if to say, stop racing, stop competing, stop scrambling. There is enough. I am enough. And finally, children teach us what divine power looks like. This, I think, is the most radical lesson of the four. A young child is the very picture of vulnerability. In some cultures, children are socially invisible. In others, they're legally unprotected. Here in the United States, children routinely suffer the catastrophic effects of lax gun laws, cruel immigration policies, unaffordable health care, underfunded schools, and racist violence. In all cultures, children are at the mercy of those who are older, bigger, and stronger than they are. And yet this shocking portrait of powerlessness is the portrait Jesus offers of God. In the divine economy, power and prestige accrue as we consent to be little, to be vulnerable, to be invisible, to be low. We gain greatness not by muscling others out of our way, but by serving them, emphasizing with them, and sacrificing ourselves for their well-being. Whatever human hierarchies and rankings we cling to, Jesus upends them all as he holds a tiny child in his arms. Do we want to see God? Do we really want to see God? Then look to the child in the pew. Look to the child in the abandoned alleyway. Look to the child detained at our border. Look to the child who has been molested. Look to the child who is fleeing from war. Look to the least of these and see the face of God. One of the most central and amazing truths of Christianity is that God became a helpless human infant. In this week's gospel story, Jesus underscores that stunning truth with another. All children represent God's heart, God's likeness, God's power. To welcome a child is to welcome the divine. To cultivate childlikeness is to cultivate godliness. To choose vulnerability is to be great in the kingdom of God. Amen. There are lots of announcements, so if I skip one, please somebody hold me accountable and let me know. First and foremost, the first one is on Saturday, the 28th, is Waycross's Fall Festival. As part of the Waycross neighborhood, all of the churches as part of the Waycross neighborhood are encouraging all of the congregations to go to this fall festival to meet some other people in our neighborhood and just to enjoy the fall season. Unfortunately, because I am bivocational, I was unable to get it off of work for myself, so I will not be there. But I'm encouraging you, as many of you who can go, to please go, enjoy the fun. I believe there's going to be chili, and there's going to be like typical fall festival stuff. On the 29th is Sunday. As a personal note, a couple people have agreed, and I would hope everybody else would agree. We're throwing a surprise pitch-in birthday party for Sarah. She turned 40 on Wednesday. And I've been trying to get this surprise party together, and it hasn't worked out, so I reached out, and some of my vestry members have agreed. We're going to do like a little pitch-in and just kind of celebrate this milestone for her. So that will be on Sunday, the 29th. Is it really the next Sunday that's October 6th, or is there one more? Okay, so then the next Sunday is October 6th, and that's Spring Mill, which will also be a pitch-in. That one is got a sign-up sheet, and that will be out at Spring Mill at which shelter? Butternut. At the Butternut shelter. And then in the afternoon is Blessing of the Animals, which will be held in Park Commons at 3 p.m. We're doing that again with all the other downtown churches. So please, if you have any animals, bring them on out. No animal too small or too large, so we'll see what we can get this year. And then it's Halloween. So if you don't mind starting to bring in your donations of candy, we get a ton of kids that come through here. It is such a blast. Yeah, am I missing anything?
I just want to point out how crisp and clear
Yes.
the insert is. And if you were to look at the green one and see like the ever-present streak that we've been dealing with forever, we got a reprinter.
Yes, we didn't buy the inserts. We printed them on our nice pretty printer that Sharon has been so gracious in handling. Anything else?
You mentioned Saturday,
The workday.
What is happening?
The work
The
day.
workday. Workday is October 5th, the Saturday before Spring Mill, and it is going to be primarily outside because really all we've been doing is mowing during this summertime. Anything else? Cool, I feel like that's a lot upcoming. So, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself an offering and sacrifice to God.